Welcome, and to those of you on Zoom, I apologize that you missed my introduction, but I'm Deb Keller with Bath Housing, and Mary Kate Kwasnick from the library is the history room director. And again, we are just touching on the history of the development of the housing in Bath as a way to think ahead to the housing challenges that we face. And again, just a couple comments I want to make that I think will ground us is that one, that as most of you probably know, Maine has the oldest housing stock in the nation. Bath has an older housing stock than the state of Maine. Two, that leads to condition issues. We definitely, because of the age of the housing stock, housing is often a mismatch to the people that are living in it, because the housing is sort of aging as are the people are aging, and sometimes that doesn't work out very well. We also have seen a disconnect between the prices in Bath, both for rental and for home ownership, that is out of whack with the incomes of people who live here. We have seen at Bath Housing a 70% increase in rents in the last 7 years. At the same time, there's been about a 14% increase in wages. So affordability problems are real. Many people who work here in Bath are not able to afford to live here in Bath. And we have some really interesting data from the studies that I talked about that show the commuting patterns of people coming in and going out. And we also see an increase in remote working and an attraction to small cities like Bath that are impacting our market. And finally, again, related to the age of the housing stock, is we've absolutely seen a lack of production of new housing units here in Bath. And again, the data we have, there are some graphs that show how little has been built here since really 1990. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Kate to touch on the historic, and I really look forward to our conversation after.
I'm just going to go ahead and hide these. Okay, thank you, Ned, for pointing that out. Usually I pull down my mask when I present. Is that okay with folks? Just for accessibility? Okay. So hi, everybody. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the History Room, which is just behind us. And I'm so excited for our program tonight. This is a really great crowd, so thank you for coming. And we're joined by a lot of people on Zoom, so thank you everybody on Zoom for coming. You'll notice tonight that we're using our OWL camera, so you can see the speakers, the screen, and also the audience, which will be really neat when Deb opens up kind of like a conversation at the end. For folks on Zoom, you'll have a little bit more of a real life experience. We also have Library Director Leslie monitoring the webinar, so please feel free to type in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to as many questions and comments as we can. Before I get started, I just want to say a few thank yous to folks who helped me with my research. So first and foremost, I owe a huge thank you to former History Room Manager Robin Haynes, who Deb mentioned, who had done really incredible work on her 2017 lecture, Bath Never Saw Such Times as These, which of course gave us the idea to build off of that and cover housing again through today and then look at the future. And I also want to thank History Room regulars Joe Mina and Ned Baxter for their research suggestions and expertise. Both of them gave me great research suggestions. And Deb from Bath Housing for the idea to work together on looking back and thinking forward. A lot of my research was pulled from two really big titles in the collection in the History Room, but we also have them downstairs available for checkout, and I think one for purchase. Henry Wilson Owen's History of Bath, Maine, and Kenneth R. Martin and Ralph Linwood Snow's Maine Odyssey. Both of these books detail the history of Bath, and I'm so grateful that we have these. They're an incredible wealth of research. So this presentation begins with World War I and the huge boom in population that presented a real need for housing development in Bath. From there, we'll move through the 20th century towards today. You can probably imagine it's very heavy towards the early 20th century because that's where our research is from. And at the end, Deb will post some guiding questions about the future of housing in Bath. I won't cover every single housing development, But I'm mostly going to talk about the developments that were needed for war workers and their families, and then the second part of the 20th century, seniors. Okay, so we start with World War I because it was really one of the first times that the city saw an incredible and urgent need for new housing development in Bath. Here, I just want to give a little bit of context about what was happening in Bath and what it was like before World War I. So between 1899 and 1902, we see the last peak of shipyard activity before the war. So at this time, the output of merchant tonnage, so not the Navy, just merchant vessels, was about 35,000 tons. It's an incredible amount. But then between 1910 and 1916, the shipyards are largely idle. We see that huge number of merchant tonnage drop to about 6,000 tons. And in all of 1910, only one vessel launched in 1910 by the Bath Marine Construction Company. And at this point, the 1910 census population of Bath was 9,396. And during this lull, only 4 shipyards survived. So we have Bath Iron Works, Kelly Spear Co., and Percy and Smalls, and then of course a new shipyard that I'll talk about in just a second. However, during this lull, BIW was busy with Navy contracts from about 1901 to 1915, and their output of naval tonnage was actually 35,000 tons, so it was a lot. So during this peak depression, during this peak lull in Bath in 1916, some new work was available in establishing the brand new Texas Steamship Company plant. So some folks were working doing that. And then of course, remember that in the midst of this depression, on July 28, 1914, that's when Austria declares war on Hungary and war breaks out. So at the onset of war, even though the United States wasn't in it yet, that demand for vessels goes way, way up as all European vessels are spoken for in the war effort. On April 6, 1917, the US declares war on Germany, and it produces a frantic call for any kind of vessel. Workers flocked to the new Texas Steamship Company yard for war work, and a new 10% plus formula was adopted by the government that paid the price of a ship plus 10% to ensure that they could be getting their ships. And that enabled really fabulous wages that people weren't used to. So by 1918, the population of Bath had nearly doubled. And it happened in just about a year to about 20,000. So remember that 1910 population was just under 10,000. And then between 1917 and 1921, we see a huge output of ships. So many people were working in the shipyards. The output of merchant naval tonnage was about 155,000 tons, and naval tonnage, mostly destroyers, was 16,000 tons. And at this time, we didn't have the Carleton Bridge yet going across the river. So workers and their families needed to live close by, a commutable distance, mostly by walking or by railway, because it wasn't that common to own a car, a personal car at that point. And then I just want to point out, this is really fun, that not all the war workers were men. So these ladies highlighted here in the November 16th, 1918 issue of the Bath Independent, we see Miss Onelda Daniels on the right and Miss Ina Newson on the left. And the excerpt reads, "Some folks may not like our clothes, but we are just doing our bit to win the war just the same. And we're the first girl rivet passers in the country too," said bright-eyed Onelda Daniels to the Times man after he had taken the above picture. Oh, the above snapshot of her and her chum, Ina Newson. So I just want to share this quotation from the Henry Wilson Owen History of Bath, which in the history room, we affectionately just call it Owen. So if you ever hear that, that's what we're talking about. So he writes, "Housing facilities were hopelessly inadequate for this influx of people. Every existing house was filled to its utmost capacity, and the overflow made use of whatever shelter could be extemporized. On the waterfront, there grew up villages of houseboats. On the vacant lots, people put up tents. Sheds, barns, and other outbuildings were converted into temporary homes, and hundreds who came to Bath to work overflowed into the neighboring towns. A special train brought several hundred workmen from Brunswick each morning and carried them back for the night. So of course, as the population begins to inflate really dramatically, it was obvious that there was a severe housing shortage. And before we begin to see the government-sponsored housing projects that most people have heard of, or a lot of people have heard of in Bath, we start to see some private developments arise in Bath. So we see Snow Park, which I just drove by it the other day. It's one street between Academy Street and Center Street. We have McKay Park, which was a large privately owned residential lot. I think it was a farm that was turned into a subdivision off of Lincoln Street at Oak Street. It was 100 acres. We have Washington Parks, which was open fields developed by Chloe, Maxim, and Roche. And then the Texas Steamship Co. bought up vacant lots downtown, and they developed homes for their employees. There was a lot at Oak Street and High Street, High and North Street, Washington Street above Winship Street. So in these cases, the developments were either privately owned lots being subdivided and developed, or they were vacant lots bought up for development. And we see a real mix of development by both private landowners and companies. So for example, in the case of the Texas Steamship Co., it was a big company developing vacant lots for their employees. And then what I think is one of the more interesting and innovative developments is that of Louis Gagney's Tented City. So he was a Lewiston native who came to Bath in 1917. And like many, he couldn't believe the trouble he had finding housing, affordable housing. I think Owen says he was sharing one room with several other men, maybe at a week's worth of wages. So really outrageous pricing. So instead, he procured a vacant lot on the north side of North Street, and he opened it as a campsite for fellow workers. He first ordered 6 tents, and he immediately filled them with workers and their families, and then he set up cottages. So by June 1918, the population of this tented city was at 150, and he had 35 cabins and tons of tents. By the end of the war, the tented city had 41 homes, a large dining tent with what I read was a skilled cook, a grocery store, and a barber shop. The cottages even had electricity, heat, and at his own expense, he brought in city water. But after the war, the tented city dissolved in the 1920s. And in this Bath Independent piece from April 27th, 1918, you can really see how lofty his ambitions were at the beginning. The piece reads, 200 cottages, so many more than we ended up with, each measuring 12 by 16 feet, are to be erected at once at the tented city on North Street. These cottages are all to be identical, the material being sawed from stock patterns and then shipped here, where a dwelling can be erected in a few hours. The roof will be 10 to 15 feet above the ground, and plans call for the houses to be light and airy. He intends to charge $5.50 a week rent, this to be applied towards the purchase of the cottage. So here's some great images of what that looked like. And even though it's called the tented city, you see so many more cottages in these images. So in this first one, we can see the cottages, a family standing. I believe she's holding a baby in her arms. I think that's the grocery store on the left-hand side, just visible. And then I don't know, but this middle building looks to me like it has a red cross in the window. So it could have been a makeshift medical station. I don't know. And then here's another view from the street, and we see rows of houses behind that first. And one thing I also noticed is that I'll point it out, and if you're on Zoom, I'm sorry you can't see my laser pointer. I even think you can see a fire hydrant. So you can see where he brought that water in. And that I can't imagine what that must have cost at his own expense. So for me, as not a Bath native, it's hard to say exactly where the tented city was because the streets that made up the tented city don't exist anymore. And new streets are there. So it's a little bit tricky, but I think it was around where I put this red box. It was just west of Gerald Street and the Androscoggin and Kennebec Street Railroad car barn. And then here's a small excerpt from the 1919 Bath City Directory showing some of the streets that popped up in the tented city and their residents. So we see Monto Ave, Rockland Ave, and Gagney Ave, which was his last name. And then here is our 1919 Sanborn map. So Sanborn maps are fire insurance maps that were developed for fire insurance companies to know how much to insure properties for. So they're really, really useful in looking at urban development. So what I think is really interesting, and I may be reading too much into this, but the tented city has been left out of the Sanborn map and they map around it. And because these were temporary structures for the most part, maybe that's why they left them out. I don't know. Maybe they didn't need insurance coverage. I really don't know. But in 1919, the tented city was still there and it's not in the map. So I think it's really interesting that they chose not to include it because it would have been right here. So the next few slides, I'll show more of this map. So here, this is the whole page where we see the area. And then this slide is just the top detail. So this, I think this would be Gerald Way, and then this is the car barn, and it was just to the west of the car barn. So maybe these are part of it, but I'm not sure, but they cut it off right there. And then this to the bottom right is just another kind of like inset part of the map where it totally skips over. It would have been down here and it goes to the Kennebec greenhouses and then Maple Grove. So I don't know what the reason is for that, but I think it's really interesting that they don't include it. Okay, so now we move into the pretty well-known government housing developments. The first of which was the Brick Project, closely followed by the White Project. In July of 1918, the Emergency Fleet Corporation purchases a huge vacant lot in the north end of Bath. And they build out 109 brick dwellings of various styles, some single family homes, some multifamily homes and duplexes, as well as a new school, Dyke School, which remember this later, Dyke School. So the development encompassed Oliver Street, Meadow Street, Valley Road, West Milan? Okay, West Milan Street, all brand new streets for development. And this is off of High Street. They also brought in sewers and other public facilities. And this particular housing development was mostly intended for the housing needs of Texas steamship employees and their families. However, by the time the armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, these homes were not yet finished. 7 families moved in by November 23rd, 1918, and the rest weren't finished until the middle of January, or the end of January, January 23rd, 1919. So most of these homes remained empty. And this is also from that 1919 Sanborn map. And so we see all these brick houses in pink. This is the development. So here's High Street. And when you pass it, when you drive north on High Street, you immediately know you're in the Brick Project. It's very, very visibly distinctive. So here are a few images of the Brick Project. On the left is a view of Oliver Street shortly after the project was built, probably early 1919, and you can really see just how much land is out there at this point. So this is kind of out there for Bath. And then to the right are some contemporary images just from Google Street View of Meadow Way and then Valley Road. And this really shows the varied designs and layouts that we see in that neighborhood. If you're having trouble placing this area, basically, like I said in the previous slide, you just imagine driving north on High Street and you'll hit it. You'll know it instantly. And it is really interesting to see. So after the Texas steamship shipyard closure after the war, the neighborhood and most of the homes were mostly vacated. The people who this was intended for weren't necessarily living there anymore. They didn't have a need to, they didn't have the jobs. So most of those homes were empty. Private sales of the homes proved pretty unsuccessful as the population dropped substantially. And I'll talk about that in a few more slides. So in 1923, the whole parcel, the entire neighborhood was sold at auction to Arthur Spear of Portland. And this is detailed in his little booklet that we have in the history room called I Bought a White Elephant in Maine. He later renamed the development Sunset Park through a contest. So we have this really, really interesting auction catalog from the 1923 auction in the history room. So I've taken some more pictures of it in the next few slides, and you can see how the neighborhood was portrayed. So we know it took place at the Armory. We know it took place at the Armory. They describe it as substantial modern 5- and 6-room brick homes in a wisely restricted neighborhood. Here we see a map of the whole neighborhood. And again, there's so much land all around it. I imagine it might have been maybe inconvenient to elsewhere in town, but we really see them here. And then it's hard to tell, but they have a description of all of the homes that they've built, what streets they're on, how large they are. And then here is Arthur G. Spear's book, I Bought a White Elephant in Maine, which details the many problems he encountered while owning the brick project. And towards the end of the book, he looks back at the experience and notes, contrary to opinion I keep running into, I did not steal the houses. It took another world war to get me out in a 20-year period. From a profit point of view, it took me too long to sell and therefore I paid too much. I was the only man who could sell the houses at a profit, and to bring the project to a close, I had to live on the scene and spend my whole time on the job. And I didn't read the whole thing, but I will say that about half of it is just complaints about tenants. so I don't think he liked being a landlord. In September of 1918, just 2 months after the start of the brick project, a second housing development emerged in Bath, this time through the Bureau of Industrial Housing. They purchased vacant land west of Lincoln Street, and the plan was to construct 78 wooden houses. These would be way more uniform than the brick project, with much less variety in structure size, lot size, and orientation. They also created Cobb, Andrews, and Dyke roads, plus Page and Plant streets, and they brought in all those sewers and other public facilities. So this development was designed intending to meet the housing needs of Bath Iron Works employees. It was much more central to Bath than the brick project. However, similar to the brick project, it wasn't completed until after the end of World War I. However, unlike the brick project, these homes were pretty steadily occupied given the central location to the city. So we don't see these homes laying vacant the way we did with the brick project. So to the right, we have a page from another book we have in the history room, which is the report of the United States Housing Corporation. And this shows one of the 5 types of houses to be built. And then here we have another page from the report showing the entire neighborhood. So we see Lincoln Street to the east, Andrews Road to the north, Dyke Road to the west, and Academy Street to the south. And then here are some contemporary images of the White Project homes today, still standing on Academy Road and Andrews Road. And then here's another page from the report showing the front elevations of all 5 types of the homes to be built. But they're still all pretty similar. 2-story single-family homes built out of wood. And I will say too that if you come visit me, this book is huge and it details so many of these World War I housing projects throughout the country. It's very interesting. So this brings us to the end of the war. Of course, it comes to a close in November 1918, and the end of the war and its resulting peace treaties leave a surplus of American vessels, and the effect on Bath's economy was disastrous. Percy and Small, Texas Steamship Co., and Kelly and Spear all shutter operations by 1923. BIW continues naval work, but eventually it goes into receivership, which is kind of like foreclosure, and it was sold in 1925. Then BIW takes on yacht contracts, but business was still really greatly diminished. There were multiple years during the Great Depression when no ships at all were launched from Bath. By 1940, however, BIW and Bath start to bounce back under renewed congressional spending towards naval shipbuilding. And BIW readies itself to expand. And in turn, expanding that labor force, we begin to see another acute labor shortage. So I just want to pause for a minute and look at this chart that I've made to look at the different population shifts in the first half of the 20th century. So in 1910, Bath's population sits at 9,396, and that's only about 650 more people than the 2020 census. So we're neck and neck with 1910. By 1920, that population had increased to 14,731. So this is a 56.8% increase, which is really something. Then by 1930, the population falls to 9,110, even less than 1910, because there was even less work. But then by 1940, we see a slight increase to 10,235. But by 1943, when we're in the middle of the war, the Bath population was estimated to be about 20,000 people living in Bath. That's a 95% increase. So I think, I don't know, but I think that the incoming housing shortage may have been even more painful than what we saw with World War I, because there were even more people. So here's a little bit of a look at how extensively BIW was expanding. In the spring of 1941, BIW had 4,150 employees. And by mid-1943, they had 12,000 employees. That's a 189% increase. And this is where they estimated that 1943 population comes into play. And that 95% population increase in just a matter of a few years. I'll also note that at this point, we do have the Carleton Bridge. So people could commute across the river. That was available. And BIW also set up a busing system for workers. However, it really didn't seem to fully alleviate the housing crisis in Bath, as we still see with those huge population numbers. So this image is from the Library of Congress, and there are quite a few images of the Library of Congress taken in Bath during World War II, showing the lives of war workers and their families and really highlighting that housing crisis. These images are in the Farm Security Administration Office of War Information photograph collection, and they're all online. So I encourage you take a look at them. They're really stunning. And I also just want to read this quotation from the 1989 book, Maine Odyssey. Part of the crowd piled into cars already wearing out from the long highway grind to and from work, somehow snaking their way onto the bridge towards farmhouses and villages near and far. Others lined up for commuter buses. The rest, local people, diffused into the narrow, littered streets of Bath, heading for home. For many of these, home was a euphemism for a prefabricated dormitory, a glorified shed, a tar-papered trailer, or a tenement rescued from demolition by the new housing crunch. So here we see both the government and unhoused workers and families scramble for housing options. At first, the Federal Housing Authority subsidizes the conversion of single-family homes into multiple apartments. And remembering some of the rental scams that people saw during World War I, the Fair Rent Commission kept watch out for fair rents. Outside of that support from the government, people really had to seek out their own accessible housing. Trailer camps open all around the city and just outside the city. We see people hooking up trailers to service stations for electricity or to the homes of friends or family. Non-winterized vacation cottages and summer camps people move into. And as you can see here, it's winter, so it must have been really cold. And I also read, I think in Maine Odyssey, that an older transformer shed at the former Percy and Smalls shipyard had been refurbished for use. So it's basically a 10 by 10 room with a wood stove and no plumbing. So people were living there. And the FSA documented a lot of these living situations. We have the following photographs and captions from the FSA photographer. So here we have some small trailers parked by homes near the shipyards. And then the longer FSA caption reads, Mr. Burton, this is the Burton family, came from Moosehead Lake region, Maine, where he used to run a sportsman camp, have been traveling around in a trailer for 3 years, had a few weeks work at one of the branches of the ironworks a number of months ago, has been unemployed since, has been trying to get work at the Bath Ironworks, but so far has been unsuccessful. Was planning to move to Bath, but with their trailer the next day. Trailer was about 5 miles out from center of Bath, had no electricity and used the sanitary facilities of a house nearby. And then this one, this is the Brown family's, they call it a shack. So here's the outside, and then this is an image of the inside. And the FSA caption reads, Mrs. Arthur Brown with 3 of her children reading the back. Oh, this is a different picture, but this is the Arthur Brown family. And I switched out the pictures because I thought this one was really, really moving, of that little baby in their house. And I think this is probably one of those places that really wasn't meant for people to be living in. It probably wasn't winterized. But the FSA caption reads, having been away from Bath for 5 years, they returned for the boom. Rents were too high in town, so they started building a place for themselves about 5 miles out of Bath on land belonging to their brother. Husband has been working a week on and off, a week on and a week off. One of the children is old enough to go to school, but it is too far out of the way for the school bus to stop for him. I don't know if that means he didn't go or not. I hope he went. So what else was done? In 1941, the Federal Lanham Act passed, and it aimed to assist communities with water, sewer, housing, schools, and other local facilities needs related to war and industry growth. So this ensured new development would be supported by the federal government. And the idea was that after the completion of these new developments, the government would send back yearly maintenance fees to offset the city expenses. So this promised 2 new housing developments in Bath, and it promised a brand new elementary school, Hughes School, for those kids. And then also in addition to Morse High School and a $265,000 addition to Bath Memorial Hospital. And I just love this image at the right from our collection. And the caption is Patriotic Children at Lambert Park Housing Development, which I'll talk about in a few slides. And that's one of the 2 housing developments, but that's a lot of kids, very patriotic. So the first of the 2 World War II housing developments built during this time was Hyde Park. It was built on 40 acres of farmland near the west end of Center Street and the new Route 1. It needed to be walking distance between walking distance to BIW and Hyde Windlass. It was completed in about half a year in 1941, and it consisted of 200 brick homes that would be of low rent for people. And they were brick because of federal limits on wood structures at the time. They were built on slabs with heaters on the ground floor. So in February 1942, that's when families start to move in. So this is now called Atlantic Townhomes. It's no longer, or it never became a Bath Housing Authority property, but it's still there. It's no longer affordable housing. But here it is. So the way I think of it, because I live in Brunswick, is when you're driving to Bath and you get off Route 1 to go to the Y, when you turn down Center Street, it's right on the right. So off of Congress and Center Street, it's all still there. So here's an image of Hyde Park after its completion, and then a contemporary image of the neighborhood. I'm not sure of the exact orientation of the black and white image, but I just realized the other day that it looks, this color image, the contemporary image, it looks a lot like this building. So it might be the same one, I'm not sure.
I think the old one is from Floral Street Hill,
Floral Street Hill.
facing west, east.
It's a good sense of direction, Joe.
I think those houses in the back are on Center Street.
Okay, so probably coming from Floral Street
Yeah,
Hill.
I think so.
Okay, cool.
Maybe I'm even all wrong.
And then, of course, here's Hughes School, which was part of that deal. So this is another school to keep your eye on. As you may know, it later became a really cool project within the last 10 years.
Now, I'm curious, I live at the Atlantic Townhouses, and as far as I know, they're also connected to Works Progress Administration money, that all of those brick buildings were part of the big Works Progress Administration bill project. And actually Bath Road was a Works Progress Administration project. And then those first structures were built in 1939. And then the secondary were 1949. Somebody's shaking their head, but I'm very interested in the history in terms of, have you tracked anything to the Works Progress Administration?
So the question is about the Works Progress Administration. I have not seen anything about it being related. There were Works Progress Administration projects in Bath, but I don't believe that was one of them. Not that I have found.
And those brick houses really should have been in a, they were built for a project down south. And the wood buildings that should have been here were built down south.
Someone just pointed out, which I didn't mention, that the buildings were built elsewhere and trucked in, is that right? And they were really built for a different climate. So they had a lot of problems with these at first. And we see that in a few other projects too. Thank you. Okay, so the second World War II development was Lambert Park. This development is also in the north end of Bath, off of High Street, just past the brick project. So in early 1942, the federal government authorizes construction on Lambert Park. So this was a complex of, I've seen it referred to as temporary, but of course they're still there, 2 family homes and dormitories originally to house about 1,200 men in double rooms. And of course it housed lots of families like those patriotic kids that we saw. It's now called Orchard Court.
Actually, it's Glen Courtyard.
Glen Court. It's now called Glen Courtyard. It's not a BHA property, similar to Atlantic Townhouses, and it's also no longer affordable housing. But this is where it is. So it is, it's like the brick project going north on High Street, north of the brick project. Wait, no, not north, but to the left. It's to the west of High Street when you're going up north on High Street. And here are some images of Lambert Park when it was being built. So this is under construction, probably around 1942. Also under construction, so they're mostly 2-story duplexes. And then here I have kind of a comparison. So this is an image shortly after it was built in the winter. And this is the entrance from High Street. And I went onto Google Street View and I tried to take that same image, and you can really see that the color image on the left still corresponds to those houses on the left, as does the one on the right. It's still there with that kind of diagonal house with the reddish roof, and then this one with the person trimming their bushes. So it still looks really similar. So when World War II ends, we see that the post-war economic decline isn't quite as steep as after World War I. BIW and Hyde Windlass maintained new contracts, and layoffs were primarily limited to out-of-towners who didn't live in Bath. This resulted in BIW cutting transportation services that they had put in place during the war. And the 5220 rule kept a lot of returning veterans from really flooding that workforce. It was a program that gave veterans $20 a week for 52 weeks or until they got a job. And a lot of people chose to take that rather than take a job from somebody else. There are some great quotes in Maine Odyssey of folks who did just that. However, the housing shortage remained in Bath as servicemen and women returned. During the Korean War, there was a potential Bath naval housing project that ended up going to Cook's Corner instead of Bath. And then we see the US government sell off Lambert Park and Hyde Park to private parties or out-of-town real estate companies. They had originally wanted Bath to buy them, but they didn't. So they sold them off to private companies. And during this post-war period, there's almost no private construction. During this time, which is truly another program for another day, a lot of energy was spent on commercial urban renewal, on that big debate, which of course Bath did not do. And that really is a whole other program. So in that mid-20th century, we see that urban renewal is voted down. And then Bath looks instead to broaden its tax base by encouraging residential development. In early 1969, the Bath Housing Authority is established. And a now well-equipped public works department could now provide roads and sewer lines to developable land. By the 1970s, life expectancy was increasing and the cost of living was increasing faster than Social Security and other retiree benefits. So Bath Housing aimed to provide comfortable, attractive, and affordable housing for retired people on fixed incomes who are being priced out of their homes through property tax increases. So these first 2 projects under the brand new BHA, I'm thinking of as kind of like false starts because they didn't end up as BHA properties. So the first was Shared Village. This is the first post-war housing development, and it was supported through a Nixon administration project called Operation Breakthrough, which was through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So the neighborhood was developed by a private developer, and similar to Atlantic townhouses, it was buildings that came in from elsewhere that really weren't designed for our climate. So they had a lot of problems with heating and freezing. The plan was that it would be privately developed and then it would be purchased by BHA. And so it went into development in 1972. It was going to be a 200 unit neighborhood off of Oak Grove Avenue near Lambert Park, and 20% would be affordable housing units and the rest for seniors. And it still exists. This is called Maritime Apartments, but it never became a Brunswick Housing Authority property. It's owned and managed privately to this day. So that was the first of those projects. And then Washington House, which so many people know, you see it as soon as you get off the highway. A lot of people know this as the high rise on Washington and Center Streets. And this is the second collaboration between BHA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It was it is a 54 unit high-rise apartment building designed exclusively for seniors. It was started in 1972 or 1973, also by a private developer. And then the plan was that it would be purchased by by Bath Housing Authority. However, it had a lot of problems because they didn't anticipate the issues with building downtown or with the type of lands that they were building on. So it ran out of money, ran out of funding from the government. It foreclosed, and then it was purchased privately. So it's still in private ownership and management today. And still that landmark right when you get off the highway. So after these projects, BHA reorganizes, because those didn't end up as properties for BHA. So they reorganize and they reframe their goals, and they decide to pursue more conventional funding routes rather than this Nixon project. So then they build their first 3 successful housing projects for seniors. So we see the Anchorage built in 1977, the Moorings built in 1979, and Seacliff built in 1982. And then this on the right is a great piece from the Times Record from September 1977, when the Anchorage was about to open and it was being toured by prospective tenants. And the gentleman sitting here is later featured in another piece that I'll show. Yeah, there he is with the Christmas tree. Same fella. So after these projects, oh, that's the same one. So yep, so here we have the first Christmas at the Anchorage, and I just love this image. So this is the same gentleman that was going to tour the facility. This is the first Christmas time at the Anchorage. And then we have the first tenant here to move into the Moorings. Her name was Lucy Moore, very first tenant, and she is quoted in this piece in the Times Record from February 1979, saying, "It's heaven," exclaimed Lucy Moore Wednesday while surveying her surroundings from her lofty 3rd floor perch at the Moorings. And then both of these pieces are about Seacliff. The one on the left is about families moving into affordable housing at Seacliff, and then on the right is about the cookie lady, also moving into a unit at Seacliff. Then also in the 1980s, BHA renovates the old Dyke School. So you probably remember this from the brick project. The school was renovated into housing for seniors and renamed Dyke's Landing. So I just love how that comes full circle, filling a need in 1918 and then filling a brand new need in 1984. And then really similarly and much more recently, we have Hughes School. So this is an instance where BHA didn't own the building, but really helped to connect the dots between the city of Bath and the Xanten Company. The Xanten Company purchased Hughes School, oh my thumb, and redeveloped it into 59 apartments. And of that number, the vast majority is set aside for affordable housing. And I just love that so many people went to that school and have great memories of the school, and it looks like it's a really, really neat building. So the slide that I'll end with before I turn things over to Deb is of the most recent project, super visible from where we stand right now. In this case, Bath Housing purchased the old YMCA building and sold it again to the Xanten Company for redevelopment. This project will build 50 new apartments and also modernize 10 existing units on the site of the former YMCA and it will be age restricted to those 55 or older and aimed at a diversity of income levels. So I'm really excited to see what BHA does next and what they do with all these beautiful old buildings. So I'm going to turn things over to Deb now to start looking towards the future.
Thank you, Mary Kate. I could watch that over and over and over because I just learn new nuggets every time. And it's just fascinating to get that historical sense of a community that I've lived in for 23 years and worked in closely for 9 years. So it's just spectacular and I can't wait to build on it. I just wanted to share a couple of observations. I had the ability to see this before you all, so I'm going to share a couple of observations and then really turn it over to you. I want to hear your observations and hear your thoughts about kind of what this means to you and how it affects you as we think ahead. First and foremost, I think what was profound for me is to really recognize that Bath has weathered acute housing shortages before. And that they've come in waves over time. And we are absolutely in an acute housing shortage situation right now. BIW tried to hire 5,000 people over the last 2 years, and their attrition rate, they brought people in and they all left. And so they weren't successful in their hiring because people didn't have a place to live. The second takeaway for me is that historically, the response of this community was creative. It was multifaceted. We were doing single families, we were doing duplexes, we were doing high rises. We were looking at a small home model that there was just an article in the Press Herald the other day about Auburn looking at the small home model to house homeless families. Man, we were ahead of the time, right? Another one is the connections of housing and transit. And how many times that came up about where the properties were, where projects were built, where housing was built, and how that related to where the jobs were. Public-private partnerships came up over and over and over. And again, location is really critical when you're talking about siting housing. I think the one thing that I haven't heard recently that came up here was I haven't heard of anybody living on houseboats yet. I could be wrong. They're very well not here. Okay. Oh yeah, in other cities, but I haven't seen Bath take to the river yet to house our unhoused people. But again, those are kind of my observations. And again, I have for what I say to people a lot lately is that the situation is as bad right now as I've seen it in my 23 years in Maine. But it is not without hope. And I would also say that I am more optimistic right now than I have been in my 20-year career in housing in Maine because of the creativity, because of the community will, because of the understanding of the housing issues and how housing is intricately part of our community and the kind of community we want to be in. I'm not going to read it. Bath Housing went through a process to create a new vision statement. We are working hard with the City of Bath, the Community Development Committee, really to think progressively, think about how we can find a variety of solutions to our housing needs. So I will stop there. I'm going to put my mask back on and I'm going to open it up. Leslie is going to provide the comments from our Zoom community, and I will bring the microphone around for your comments. Do you have any, Leslie?
Nothing.
Nothing yet. Okay, so I'm going to start here.
Why do you limit yourself to talking about Bath as opposed to the area? Because a lot's going on in Brunswick. There's probably more vacant land in West Bath and in Woolwich and going down the peninsulas than there is in Bath. Why not deal with it in a regional sense?
That is a great question. The question was, why do we talk just about Bath and not talk about this as in a regional sense? And as a matter of fact, we very much are talking about it in a regional sense. Our strategic plan outlines regional goals. Thanks to Senator Vitelli, who is here right now, and Senator Maddie Daughtry, we have convened a group that is comprised of employers, housing organizations, municipalities, from Bath to Freeport, looking at the 14-mile corridor and how we can be looking regionally. In general, and again, as the history presentation shows, the bulk of the housing especially larger projects, were built in Bath because of the proximity. You have a situation where you can build higher density housing in a community like Bath because it has public water and sewer, where some of these smaller communities don't. Bath Housing, just to be clear, we serve Bath, West Bath, Woolwich, Georgetown, Arousic, and Pittsburgh. What we find is that we have different housing strategies for different types of communities. And so building a 40-unit property might not be appropriate in Woolwich, but it doesn't mean Woolwich doesn't have a responsibility, and it doesn't mean we aren't working to promote different housing solutions in a community like Woolwich.
Thank you.
I would just mention about small housing that I grew up in the 50s where families lived in small houses, and over the past 60 or 70 years, houses have become so big. I think that's part of the problem. They're very big, they're very expensive, and I think it also has an effect on the community and on the family. And I think it's a social problem as well as a housing problem. And I'm thinking also of after Katrina and after the earthquake in San Francisco and the temporary houses you showed. That's a real opportunity that people to have individual homes that are 500 square feet, maybe. They don't have to be so big.
I'll just paraphrase that, and the comment was that houses have gotten bigger and bigger, and that keeping a smaller home solution could be a good option. And I will just to Bath Housing's horn again, we worked with the vocational school, Bath Tech, and we helped place a 600 square foot home on Chestnut Street on a vacant lot that Bath Housing owned. And it was a phenomenal partnership project. And it is an absolute beautiful home at 600 square feet. And we were able to bring it in at a price that was affordable to a household at 80% of the median income or less.
Wow.
So hopefully we can do more of that.
Thank you. I'm a visitor here, and this is our second time to Bath, and we're here because we love it. It's such a beautiful city. A lot of the housing, it looked like a lot of work was done for retirement, older people, retired people. How much of the community is composed? Most of us here are like over 21. How much of it is retired people from here and people moving in because we can go anywhere we want now and our money keeps rolling in? And how great a problem is that?
Okay, so the question was, if I get this right, how much of the problem is people moving to Bath with disposable income, et cetera, and how many, right, is that basically the question? So I don't have the data or the statistics with me. What I will say, and I have a new appreciation kind of, again, for the historical context, is that in my reading of the Odyssey book, I was really intrigued to see that since the 80s, there has been conversations around gentrification and displacement in Bath. I was thinking it was new, silly me. It's not. It's a conversation that this community and all communities have been having for years. It just really rose up recently, I think, with the pandemic and with a lot of people moving because they can work remotely. We've always seen people retire into Bath. For sure, and I think we always will, and we always want people who want to live here to be able to live here. The way I have talked about it historically is that we want to welcome and we want to bring people here, but we need to make sure that we have policies in place that we're not displacing the people that are already here. And that is something that we're grappling with, and we are trying to make sure that we're doing everything we can to both welcome all newcomers as well as keep mechanisms that people can stay here that want to be here.
Excuse me, sorry, someone's asked to turn off the share screen so that we can see
Is
the.
that okay with you, Deb?
Oh, yeah, okay. Oh, so that will keep it then.
Yes, yeah.
No problem.
So many things to say.
This is a great presentation. Thank you both. I'm really thinking about the last couple questions, and this is more of a pondering to the group versus a question. it's really interesting to see the connection to World War I, World War II, which I think there's been great reporting and history of. And I think about, kind of the value we were putting as a society on, winning the war, frankly, but we were all in it together value. And the comment about small houses and keeping people who live and work, who currently live and work here, who are also providing phenomenal value to our society and our community. I just wonder what steps are we taking together to articulate that value in a way that could be similar to we're all in it. Someone mentioned WPA before, we're all in it together. So that's one. And then someday I want to understand decisions around multifamily, which seems like another great option versus individual housing, but that's another talk too, probably, Deb. So that's a question for the group.
I'd like to respond to
Can you
that.
hold the microphone closer so that we know?
I'd like to respond to that because I think there is a division in Bath and elsewhere between the haves and the have-nots. And a lot of the building that's going on for retirees, like along the river, is just very expensive. And I think I agree with you. We need to be all in it together. And I don't know if you want to address this about the accessory dwelling units that are taking affordable apartments and turning them into $2,000 rentals.
I'm going to make two quick comments and then we have one.
I mean,
from the
Airbnb.
chat, and then we have a couple more comments. So Kate, thank you. You got the conversation going here. First of all, we are all in this together, and part of the idea of having this forum is to get these conversations going and help people understand that that it is important for our community and the health of our community to have a range of housing options. And that's really kind of at the core of what Bath Housing is doing. We want to make sure there's a range of housing options. And again, we have lots of ambitious plans going forward. And the more we're talking with all of you and the more the community understands it, hopefully the more support we have going forward with those ambitious plans. So secondarily, policy-wise, the city of Bath right now is working on an update to its comprehensive plan. The city of Bath has a community development committee, which I am on. Phyllis Bailey is here. She represents that committee as well as a city councilor. That committee helped advance an accessory dwelling unit ordinance here in the city of Bath that allows, there's actually a great new promotional piece available on what the ordinance means, how to use it. It's through the age-friendly communities of Lower Kennebec County. So I'm not going to go into detail, but the beauty of the ordinance in Bath is that basically any single family or duplex can add an accessory unit. There is a requirement in the city of Bath's ordinance that those cannot be rented as short-term rentals. They have to be rented for more than 90 days. That does differ than the new state law, LD 2003, which also allows ADUs, accessory dwelling units statewide, does not have that same provision that Bath has. So we did put that into effect proactively. We have a comment from the.
Oh, got a few from the chat,
Okay.
a few questions. So Gail Witherell asks, currently is Bath's need more for young families or for older folks?
Yes.
Oh,
You have another one?
Yes, okay. Robert Gersh asks, what is the Bath Housing's next planned housing project after the Morris Building former YMCA project that is restricted to residents who are age 55 or older? He said, I thought I saw an article about BHA awarded funds from the federal government for new housing development. If that's true, where will the housing be located in Bath? And will it also be restricted to seniors?
And sorry, I didn't mean to be snippy with the response, but the need is wide ranging. There is need for family apartments. There is need for seniors. The waiting list that we have for apartments that are subsidized is anywhere between 2 and 4 or 5 years long right now. There just is not enough housing right now for anything. Bath Housing did announce we have funding from the state of Maine, not the federal government, from Maine State Housing Authority to build 18 new apartments in one building, walkable to downtown. We have not released the site yet, but we're very excited about it. We're having our design kickoff meeting next week. We have a process with our abutters to make sure they're on board before we release the site publicly, and expect to hear more about that.
I'm a newcomer to Bath. I moved here in 2013, so I'm from away.
I've got a couple of ideas. One is, and I think I sent something to the senator about this, set up a fast rail service from Lewiston down to Brunswick and up to us, down from Rockland area. It could also be tied in with going down to Portland. Get the cars off the roads, get the cars out of South Bath. Tied in with that, some of the properties down there that are substandard perhaps might be better utilized somewhere else, by being moved, and provide VIW with some land where they could build some multi-story parking areas. That's one off the wall. Secondly, we've got some land, it's called, I think, the Cannery Lot up by the sewage treatment plant. Perhaps that could be developed if Mr. Pelican would donate it to the city. You get a tax break, obviously. Develop it for units that were geared to single high-tech type people. I talked with a guy that was living over and back with me in Davenport, that he wanted something that was not going to be causing him a lot of housekeeping. So if maybe we could put some condos in on that property geared to the younger people that people were asking about, that is a step above the college dorm that they came out of, but not so much that it would keep them from being able to go out and party at night if they wanted to.
Thank you for these ideas. That's exactly why we're here. I will say that the transit conversation, again, could be a whole other 3-4 hour forum. For those of you that don't know, we do have the Blue Line now, which is a bus that goes from Lewiston to Bath and to Brunswick. So if you look up the Blue Line in Bath, there are bus connectors now that somehow a lot of people, I don't think, have realized that this is going on. It is not high-speed rail. Part one. Part two, I will let you take your suggestions on the Stinson Cannery to Mr. Poliquin. And I will say that the core, so when you want to build housing or create new housing units, one thing we have that maybe we didn't have throughout the historical presentation is zoning. And the zoning laws of the community really dictate what can and cannot be built. And so certainly the Stinson Cannery is there's a big zoning question there about what can and can't happen there. So I'll just set that aside, but I appreciate that.
But if it hasn't sold since I moved here in 2015, obviously commercially no one wants it. So maybe it could be used for an inexpensive condo instead of an expensive.
I think there's the Stinson is one of many really interesting lots in town that'll be fascinating to see what happens. I'm sure it was first one, three before. I'll get it right.
I guess I would say to people, don't wait for government to do the job. Part of our strategy, working on the Community Development Committee and creating an accessory dwelling unit ordinance in Bath, along with educational tools, is that Deb gave me this number, I hope I'm quoting you properly, that if 5% of the households or housing units in Bath created an accessory dwelling unit, we immediately have 132 units on the market. And the accessory dwelling units can be in your attic, in your garage, in your basement, attached to your house, and even detached from your house. And they only have to be less than 850 square feet. You could configure that to make it 2 bedrooms so that you could have a family with a child. And so that's what I would encourage people to think seriously about. That's why we're doing an educational push and why we've published a guidebook that really gives you some guardrails for what it takes to do it.
I think it's important to acknowledge that it definitely is not an inclusive area. This is a very exclusive area. And there is not workforce housing, and it's frightening to be the head of household of a family of 3 here. As a professional with a master's degree, no family cannot find housing. Negotiate yourself a salary that puts you at 1/3 of what a living wage is for this area. So it's not exclusive. And the pandemic has really worsened it substantially. And I am shocked to hear repeatedly of housing being taken over, sold to private developers who literally seem to live in another planet. And why are people's natural resilience zoned out? People can happily live in sheds and tents. That's not allowed. So what is public housing? It's supposed to be an answer to poverty. And instead, the poor are so demoralized by the treatment. And I think that's really the conversation around, inclusiveness is the story of white poverty that we're seeing, that we don't really know how to come to terms with, but it's extremely complex. And this is not an inclusive area. It is extremely exclusive. And how I see when I look at the story, so much federal money that gets put forward and then somehow gets hidden. And I think it seems to get hidden, in private money. And we don't have a functional public. So I'm happy to come here and talk to everyone, but we're really in crisis. And I would say shacks, because we're going to see people keep moving here because of the climate crisis on the planet. And so, I'll tell you right now, do I look fancy? Do I look like I got it together? We're fighting poverty here big time.
Yeah, I think, thank you, by the way, for those comments. Working at Bath Housing, we have a housing navigation staff that helps people who come and have a long-term housing need, and we will help sort of them navigate the very challenging system of finding a place that might work for them, and the long waiting lists and the lack of subsidies and whatnot. A big part of our job is saying no to people and giving them dignity while we say no. And a big part of my job is propping up my staff, who are day in and day out hearing just the most devastating stories that you can imagine about where people are living and how people are living and how they're working 1 or 2 or 3 jobs and they're not able to make ends meet. In organizations and businesses that we all patronize, it is really bad right now. And I guess part of me I do want to hold out hope, but and I don't like to run around and say the word crisis, but it is bad right now. I appreciate Phyllis's comments about the ADUs and people having a role, because it's going to take Bath Housing 2 or 3 years to build 18 apartments. It's going to take another 2 years for the Uptown to be completed construction. And these are expensive projects. It costs a lot of money to build right now. So how do we better use our housing stock and grow our base of housing stock? And this is why I'm just going to touch on it. I'm not sure how much more time we have, but we're working on a 4-pronged strategy. It includes both policy and planning aspects to the work, production, getting some new units built, making sure that we have and are promoting direct assistance programs to support families that are really struggling right now. It is only going to get worse because the rent relief program has now ended here in Maine. And as a community, we're grappling with what that's going to look like. People have used the rent relief money to help pay their rent so that they can pay more for gas and buy groceries and other things. And that is being pulled out from them. And then finally, really thinking about preservation. And so that's to your point, we have seen so Bath Housing runs the housing choice voucher program. So somebody would get a housing subsidy and go rent an apartment in the private market. We used to work with, when I say used to, 8 years ago, we worked with 75 landlords that rented to 1 or 2 voucher holders. So we would call these mom and pop or DIY landlords. We work with 45 landlords now. 30 landlords have gotten out of the landlord business in the last 7 years. They have cashed out, they're gone about their retirement. The people that are coming in and buying the multifamilies, buying these units are not necessarily maintaining that interest of renting to voucher holders or renting to lower income people. They're paying more for these buildings, they're doing some renovations, and then they're jacking up the rents. And that's why we've seen this rent increase. So I'm working tirelessly at the local, regional, state, and national level to advocate for more resources to do more preservation. And as a matter of fact, on Monday, I presented to the legislature's commission to look at housing issues, including issues around short-term rentals. And so again, I've been advocating at a state level to try to get resources to support buying some of these smaller properties. Bath Housing has been a model in the state. Honestly, we've acquired, I think maybe 7 smaller properties between 2 and 6 units that we're able to keep renting to people with vouchers or at modest rents. But again, it's a drop in the bucket compared to the need.
That's what you mean by preservation.
Preservation means a lot of things. And that's one of the things that we mean by preservation.
Got a couple more questions on the chat. Mary Lou Colsey asks, has there been any discussion about water and sewer being extended past the bridge at Whiskey Creek? And what is the likelihood that that might change the zoning in North Bath to allow for higher density and multi-unit housing?
Those are great questions. I don't have an answer to either of them. Those would be conversations to have with folks at the city.
And there's one more, let's see. What types of creative housing are you looking at now? Cooperatives? Portland is looking at a project such as this on Lambert Street in Portland. Other thoughts?
Yeah, the cooperative housing model, for those of you who knew Al Smith was a tireless advocate for cooperative housing in the city of Bath. And actually the city and Bath Housing did do a cooperative housing project. Unfortunately, it didn't work. But there's a new model for cooperatives, and we are closely watching it statewide to see how it's working and see if it's a model that we could bring to Bath. The other thing that Bath has, and I'm not sure if all of you know, but we have a program that Bath Housing started called Comfortably Home. This is a free program for people to do home modifications to help them thrive in their homes as they age. And generally they're inexpensive, but high impact modifications. And it could be putting a second banister to go upstairs or downstairs. It could be improving your lighting, lever faucets as people have arthritic hands. Simple modifications. We created it here in Bath. Maine State Housing Authority has helped replicate it statewide to 10 organizations running this program now. And HUD, actually, the federal government used it as a model for a national program, older adult home modification program, all started here in Bath. We've now served 300 homes. And again, helping people stay in their own home. That's a bit of preservation, right? So that they don't have to move out and take up stock. And also they don't want to move out of their home. So again, we always talk about a range of housing options. And so it could be helping people thrive and stay in their own home. It could be eviction prevention to make sure people aren't needlessly losing their housing just because they have a little bit of back rent or a small issue that could be mediated. It could be cooperative development. It could be small homes. It could be multifamily. Again, the key from my perspective is it's not any one thing. It could be accessory dwelling units. And I do think that's what makes our community unique is that we are looking at such a broad range of strategies, what's appropriate to Bath, what's appropriate to Woolwich, what's appropriate to West Bath, thinking regionally, talking regionally. So again, despite how bad it is, I think we're in a great place and there's a lot of hope and a lot of good things to look forward to. How are we on time? We need to wrap up. I'm happy to stay. we need to tie up, there's,
It's fine, I mean, if anybody else has questions.
okay, we're gonna take one more, Karen. Feel free to leave if you.
This is, I guess, in response to the workforce housing. The families that are really struggling because the marketplace is out of reach as much as it is that their income stream is not enough. And I know that you've built a consortium along the corridor and you're working with some of the larger employers. At what point would the public be able to participate in that conversation?
The question is there public participation opportunities? And I'm going to say sort of in general, certainly the work that's happening at the City of Bath Community Development Committee is always open to the public for people to come in and participate or comment at those meetings. Bath Housing Authority, our board meetings are all public. People are welcome to come in on that. I would say that the informal regional consortium is really sort of just getting some legs under it, and there's not really any process right now. It's early conversations. But I think if there are policy issues or changes that, certainly there's always a public participation process. So, and I would be remiss, I did put a sign up sheet out there if you want to be added to Bath's housing interest list. We send out periodic emails with just interesting housing news. Our Facebook page, we try to keep both smaller things that are happening, but also sharing articles of interest around housing issues. And I think that is it. Are we okay to keep going?
It's up to you.
Let's just do this last one and then.
Last one.
Okay, this is an easy one. Could you just say in a few sentences, Deb, what the sort of more current model is for cooperative housing? I mean, you want to Al's work way back, but what's the thinking now?
I am not an expert on cooperative housing, but there is a state law. Can either of you from Genesis, can you speak cooperative housing? There's a state law that defines cooperative housing and seems to have created sort of better legal structure that is working. And again, there's a group in Lewiston that has had some good success with this. And then there's a group out of Portland that is working on a project. So I don't know enough about it to be able to speak articulately about it, just to say that if, should we find that this is a model that's working well, we will do everything we can to bring developers that know what they're doing to try to do something with that.
Did you define co-housing?
It's not co-housing, cooperative housing
Oh, excuse me.
would be where you have an ownership interest. So you don't own your unit, but you have an ownership interest in the
Yes.
property.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you all for being here again. I will stick around. The library closes at 8, and so happy to have your participation. Waste your night. Did I waste